"Move away from her," Kang Dae-Riven shouted harshly. The command sliced through the air like a blade, and 200 guests froze mid-breath. Phones that had been raised to record the drama suddenly stopped moving. Elliot Voss, standing opposite them, froze mid-reaction with his hand still raised in a powerless, incomplete gesture. His face was filled with utter shock, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, as if he could not believe what was happening in front of him. Elliot had been the one in charge just moments ago. He had ruthlessly cancelled his engagement to Saryna Cole in front of the entire gala, loudly exposing her family's sudden bankruptcy and calling her a worthless, gold-digging burden. Saryna, dressed in a striking red gown that now contrasted beautifully against the heavy tension of the room, had been pushed past her breaking point. Caught between fear and relief, her eyes were downcast, her face tense, and her body leaning heavily as she began to collapse from the emotional overwhelm. But she didn't hit the floor. At the center of the scene stood Kang Dae-Riven, radiating raw authority and dominance. Dressed in a slightly unbuttoned white shirt that exposed a bold, intricate tattoo climbing up his neck, he had stepped out of the crowd. He was not a man who shouted often, but when he did, the room listened. Dae-Riven held Saryna Cole firmly in his arms, not just protectively, but possessively, like someone who had already decided the outcome of the entire situation. Saryna's hand rested lightly against his chest, a subtle but powerful detail showing that she felt safer in his arms than anywhere else. "Put her down." Elliot's voice boomed through the speakers as he tried to reclaim dominance. He took a step forward, his raised hand pointing desperately at the stranger. "This is none of your business. You do not know who you are dealing with." Dae-Riven turned his head just enough to look at Elliot over his shoulder. His jaw was clenched, his brows furrowed, and his expression burned with controlled rage. "Yes, I do," Dae-Riven said. His voice was deathly quiet now, but it cut through every whisper in the room. His eyes were locked forward with lethal focus. "You are Elliot Voss. You own a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, and you took out your largest corporate loan 8 months ago from Crown Capital." Elliot stopped walking. His expression shifted rapidly from anger to confusion and then to pure terror. "Crown Capital is one of my syndicates," Dae-Riven continued calmly, his grip on Saryna unshaken. "Which means your business, your properties, and your entire cash flow exist solely because I allow them to exist. My name is Kang Dae-Riven. And if you ever speak to this woman again, I will personally make sure every single loan you have is called in by Monday morning." No one in the ballroom moved. No one spoke. 200 guests, men in tuxedos and women in elegant gowns, stood completely still with their faces carrying a mix of shock, confusion, and silent judgment. Dae-Riven looked at Elliot for 3 more seconds, making absolutely sure the message was received. Then, he turned and carried Saryna out of the ballroom while 200 people watched and did absolutely nothing to help. Welcome back to Underworld Love Chapters. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like, comment and tell us where you are watching from, because this story is about to take a turn that you didn't expect. Now let's get back to the story. The heavy glass doors of the Grand Pearl Hotel glided shut behind them, cutting off the suffocating whispers of the 200 guests. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp, a sharp contrast to the stifling, humored cruelty of the ballroom. Saryna could feel her heart hammering violently against her ribs, her breath hitching in ragged, uneven shallow gasps. Her vision was still swimming, the image of Elliot's mocking smile and her ruined red gown blurring together into a messy smear of color. She expected to be handled roughly. This was, after all, Kang Dae-Riven. He was a man whose very name was spoken in hushed, terrified tones in the highest corridors of power. He was the undisputed king of the city's dark underbelly, a figure of lethal focus and absolute control. But as he carried her down the wide marble steps of the hotel toward a waiting fleet of black sedans, his movements were surprisingly steady and incredibly gentle. There was no roughness in the way his strong arms cradled her body. He held her securely, moving with a deliberate smoothness that ensured she didn't feel a single jarring bump. Her hand still rested against his chest, and through the fine, unbuttoned white cotton of his shirt, she could feel the steady, calm rhythm of his heartbeat. It was an anchor in the middle of her personal hurricane. A driver in a dark suit quickly opened the rear door of a heavily armored black car. Dae-Riven did not simply shove her inside or hand her off. Instead, he leaned down with painstaking care, shielding the top of her head with his hand so she wouldn't strike the frame. He gently lowered her onto the plush, heated leather seat. Saryna curled in on herself immediately, pulling her knees toward her chest as the sheer weight of the night's betrayal finally crashed over her. Tears she had been fiercely holding back began to spill over her lashes, tracing hot, wet paths down her cheeks. She was bankrupt. She was publicly humiliated. She had nothing left. She expected him to get in and demand answers, or perhaps bark orders at his driver. Instead, Dae-Riven stood by the open door for a long, quiet moment, his broad frame blocking the flashing cameras of paparazzi who were already starting to gather at the edge of the property. He reached into the vehicle, ignoring her flinch, and pulled a soft, folded cashmere blanket from the side compartment. Without saying a word, he draped it carefully over her trembling shoulders, tucking it gently around her shivering frame to cover the ruined silk of her dress. When he finally slid into the spacious back seat beside her, he maintained a respectful distance, giving her the space she desperately needed to breathe. He did not look at her directly, nor did he offer empty, hollow words of comfort. He simply tapped the privacy glass, and the car glided silently into the dark city streets. Despite the fierce tattoo marking his neck and the raw dominance he had just displayed to the world, sitting there in the quiet darkness, Saryna felt a strange, overwhelming sense of security. The monster of the underworld had just become her silent guardian. The armored car glided to a halt in the subterranean garage of a towering glass monolith in the heart of the city. Saryna kept the cashmere blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders, her fingers clutching the soft fabric as if it were a shield against the rest of the world. She watched through the tinted window as a team of armed security personnel in crisp, identical dark suits instantly flanked the vehicle, their postures alert and eyes scanning the shadows. A fresh wave of paralyzing fear washed over her. She knew who Kang Dae-Riven was, everyone did. He was the undisputed king of the city's underbelly. The calculated violence and absolute power associated with his name were the stuff of urban legends. Now, she was entering his private stronghold, completely at his mercy. Dae-Riven stepped out of the car first, offering her his hand. Saryna hesitated, looking from his large, calloused hand up to the sharp lines of his face and the bold tattoo tracing his neck. But as she looked back at the cold concrete of the garage, the harsh reality of her situation settled heavily in her chest. Elliot had ensured her public ruin. Her family was bankrupt, her phone was undoubtedly blowing up with cruel messages from fair-weather friends, and she had absolutely nowhere else to go. Trembling, she placed her hand in his. He didn't pull her. He simply guided her toward a private, high-speed elevator that required both a biometric scan and a specialized keycard to operate. The doors slid open at the very top of the building, revealing a sprawling, ultramodern penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the glowing city skyline below, making the space feel like a luxurious glass cage suspended in the sky. The interior was a study in cold, minimalist perfection, marble floors, dark leather, and sharp geometric lines. Yet, despite the intimidating grandeur, it was profoundly silent and impeccably secure. There were no prying eyes here, no cameras held by mocking socialites, and no venomous whispers to tear her down. Dae-Riven led her toward a plush, oversized sofa arranged before a roaring, modern fireplace. "You are safe here," he said, his deep voice slicing through the thick silence of the apartment. It wasn't a question or a gentle reassurance, it was an absolute declaration of fact. "No one enters this floor without my explicit permission. My staff will prepare a room for you, and a doctor is on standby if you need any medical attention." He stood a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back, looking more like a protective guardian than the ruthless monster the world believed him to be. Saryna sank onto the soft cushions of the couch, the warmth from the fire slowly seeping into her frozen bones. Looking out at the vast, uncaring city below, the fear of the man standing before her began to give way to a heavy, exhausting sense of relief. She was still terrified of his world, but in this quiet, highly secured sanctuary, she was no longer being hunted. For the first time all night, she could finally let her guard down and breathe. By the next morning, the high-altitude serenity of the penthouse was shattered by the digital roar of the outside world. Saryna sat wrapped in a heavy robe by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring in disbelief at the glowing screen of her tablet. The footage was everywhere. Millions of eyes had already watched the high-definition video of Elliot publicly tearing her down, calling her a worthless, gold-digging burden. But the clip didn't end there. The internet was utterly captivated by the second half, the moment the sea of 200 elite guests parted like the Red Sea as Kang Dae-Riven stepped out of the shadows. Comment sections across every major social media platform were in an absolute frenzy. The world was analyzing the bold tattoo climbing up Dae-Riven's neck, the unbuttoned white shirt, and the possessive, unwavering grip he had used to lift Saryna off the floor. People were calling him the Dark Knight of the Underworld, while Elliot was being dragged across the internet as a cruel, cowardly narcissist who had been utterly castrated by a real man's presence. A few miles away, in a sprawling glass office that used to feel like his kingdom, Elliot was losing his mind. Terrified of the viral humiliation destroying his carefully curated public image and spooking his investors, he aggressively ordered his public relations team to draft a counter-statement. He needed to spin the narrative, to paint Saryna as an unstable, manipulative woman and Dae-Riven as a violent thug who had kidnapped her. But as the morning progressed and the public mockery intensified, Elliot's panic turned into desperate rage. Bypassing his lawyers, he picked up his phone and dialed Saryna's private number. Saryna jumped as her phone buzzed on the marble coffee table, the caller ID flashing the name of the man who had crushed her heart just hours before. Her hand shook as she pressed the device to her ear. "You think you've won something, don't you?" Elliot's voice hissed through the speaker, venomous and dripping with a desperation he couldn't quite hide. "You think hiding behind that tattooed monster makes you safe? Listen to me very carefully, Saryna. You are going to go online right now and tell the world that everything in that video was a misunderstanding. You are going to apologize to me publicly. If you don't, I will use every resource I have left to destroy whatever shred of a reputation your bankrupt family has left. I will bury you so deep you'll never see the light of day again." Saryna opened her mouth to speak, her throat tight with a familiar, suffocating fear. But before a single word could escape her lips, a large, calloused hand reached smoothly into her line of sight and took the phone from her grasp. Dae-Riven stood beside the couch, his expression an absolute mask of cold, lethal focus. He didn't even put the phone to his ear. He simply pressed the speaker button. "The only thing getting buried, Elliot," Dae-Riven said, his voice a low, terrifying growl that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room, "is your empire." With a single, effortless squeeze of his hand, Dae-Riven crushed the phone, letting the shattered pieces of glass and plastic rain down onto the plush rug. The shattered remnants of Saryna's phone lay forgotten on the plush rug, but the heavy silence that followed was far from peaceful. Dae-Riven turned away from her, his broad shoulders tense as he walked over to a massive, curved monitor on the far side of the penthouse. The screen glowed in the dim light, displaying a complex, rapidly updating web of financial data, corporate holding structures, and live stock tickers. Saryna watched him from the sofa, her heart still hammering against her ribs. She was witnessing a master at work, though the sheer scale of his power terrified her. Dae-Riven didn't use guns or physical violence to wage this war, he used the cold, calculating leverage of digital capital. He pulled out a sleek, encrypted smartphone and made a single call. "Liquidate the Voss assets. Call in the Crown Capital Bridge loans immediately. No extensions. "No negotiations," he commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. He hung up without waiting for a reply and began typing rapidly on a mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking filling the quiet room. On the screen, Saryna watched as the financial empire Elliot Voss had spent his entire adult life building began to violently unravel. Crown Capital Partners, the massive shadow syndicate Dae-Riven controlled, held the primary debt on almost all of Elliot's luxury developments. With a few keystrokes, Dae-Riven pulled the plug on the empire's life support. Notifications began flashing in bright red across the monitor. A major downtown high-rise project was abruptly halted as funding was frozen. Foreclosure notices were automatically generated for 3 of Elliot's primary commercial properties. Saryna watched, transfixed, as a live news feed on the corner of the screen reported a sudden, catastrophic freefall in the stock price of Voss Enterprises. Trading was halted as panic gripped his investors. Dae-Riven sat back in his leather chair, his dark eyes reflecting the chaotic red glow of the failing stocks. There was no joy on his face, no triumphant smile. There was only the cold satisfaction of a predator who had executed a flawless strike. He had promised to dismantle Elliot's life by Monday morning, and he was fulfilling that promise with ruthless efficiency. Saryna realized then that Elliot's desperate threats on the phone had been nothing more than the terrified thrashing of a cornered animal. Elliot had believed his wealth and high society status made him untouchable. He had no idea he was playing a game against a monster who owned the very ground he was standing on. Dae-Riven didn't look back at her as he continued to monitor the digital destruction. He simply stared at the falling numbers, a silent guardian watching the world burn to keep her safe. In that moment, Saryna understood that the man with the bold tattoo climbing up his neck was infinitely more dangerous than she had ever imagined, and that she was the only person in the world he wouldn't crush. The days that followed were heavy with a deceptive calm, a false peace born of absolute isolation. Saryna remained sequestered at the top of the glass monolith, watching from afar as the digital world chronicled the swift, violent collapse of the Voss Empire. But being trapped in a cage, no matter how golden or secure, was beginning to suffocate her. Craving the simple sensation of the wind against her skin, she finally ventured down to a heavily guarded, private outdoor terrace on the 10th floor to breathe in some fresh air. She pulled the thick fabric of her coat tight against her chest, staring out at the blurred lights of the city. She thought she was alone. She thought the layers of elite security and biometric scans made this space untouchable. She was wrong. Driven to utter madness by the total evaporation of his wealth and social standing, Elliot Voss had used the very last of his liquid cash to bypass the building's perimeter. He didn't come to talk or plead. Consumed by a toxic cocktail of desperation and pure rage, he had hired a small crew of ruthless, untraceable street thugs to do his dirty work. Saryna heard the heavy, metallic clatter of the fire escape door bursting open before she saw them. 3 large men in dark hoodies flooded onto the terrace, their faces obscured. Before she could scream or even process the threat, they surged forward, cornering her against the glass railing. Fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped her throat. She was trapped, 100 feet in the air, looking into the eyes of men who had nothing left to lose. One of them reached out, his heavy hand aiming to grab her and pull her away from the security cameras. But before his fingers could brush the fabric of her coat, the heavy glass doors to the interior of the building didn't just open, they exploded outward. A blur of black suits flooded the terrace. Dae-Riven's elite security detail moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. They didn't issue warnings. They didn't draw weapons to negotiate. They acted with the swift, absolute violence of a well-oiled machine. The lead attacker was neutralized in a fraction of a second, his wrist shattered and body slammed hard against the cold concrete floor. The second was caught in a chokehold, his feet leaving the ground as a guard cut off his oxygen with practiced ease. The third tried to flee back toward the fire escape, but he was ruthlessly tackled to the ground, his face pressed painfully into the gravel. It was over in less than 10 seconds. A masterclass in absolute defense. Through the settling dust and the groans of the defeated men, Kang Dae-Riven stepped out onto the terrace. He didn't look at the thugs groveling on the ground. His eyes, burning with a furious, controlled fire, were locked entirely on Saryna. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, grabbing her by the shoulders to inspect her for injuries. His hands were shaking slightly, the first crack in his otherwise unbreakable, stoic armor. Saryna stared up at him, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was still terrified by the violence she had just witnessed, but as she looked into his protective, panicked eyes, she knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the most dangerous man in the city would burn the entire world to ashes just to keep her safe. The heavy scent of metallic blood and cold concrete on the terrace eventually gave way to the sterile, quiet atmosphere of the penthouse's private medical wing. The high-octane adrenaline of the ambush had faded, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating exhaustion that seemed to age Kang Dae-Riven by a decade. He sat on the edge of a leather examination table, his unbuttoned white shirt discarded, exposing the full, intricate tapestry of tattoos marking his broad back and shoulders. Standing before him was Dr. Eris Thorne, a man who had been on the syndicate's payroll for years, bound by absolute silence and ironclad loyalty. The doctor was not looking at the fresh scrapes on Dae-Riven's knuckles from the fight. He was staring intensely at a glowing digital scan of Dae-Riven's internal organs, tracing the web of dark, failing tissue spreading outward from the center. "The latest blood work confirms what I feared, Dae-Riven," Dr. Thorne said, his voice a low, clinical murmur that did nothing to mask the gravity of his words. "The neurotoxin from the rival syndicate's assassination attempt last year didn't kill you immediately, but it is doing its work. It was a slow-acting poison, engineered to be irreversible once it bonded to your central nervous system." Dae-Riven didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still, his jaw clenched as he stared at the far wall. This was not a sudden revelation, but rather a brutal confirmation of the ticking clock he had been carrying inside him for months. "How long?" Dae-Riven asked, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm growl that sliced through the sterile silence of the room. Dr. Thorne sighed heavily, closing the digital file. 6 months. At the very absolute most. Your internal organs are slowly failing. The medication I've prescribed can manage the pain and mask the external symptoms for a while, but it cannot stop the progression. You are running on borrowed time. Dae-Riven closed his eyes, his brows furrowing as a sudden, sharp image of Saryna flashed in his mind. He remembered the pure terror in her eyes on the terrace, and the way her small, trembling hands had gripped his shoulders when he pulled her to safety. He had stepped into her life to save her from the cruel humiliation of her past, to shield her from the monsters of the world. But now, he was faced with the ultimate, bitter irony. The biggest monster she would have to face was the grief he would inevitably leave her with. He was a man who had built an empire on absolute control, a king who bent the city's dark underbelly to his will with a single word. Yet, facing his own mortality, he had never felt more powerless. "Keep the medication flowing," Dae-Riven commanded, opening his eyes with a cold, lethal focus. He stood up, slowly putting his shirt back on to hide the tattoos and the invisible death sentence etched beneath them. "And not a word of this to Saryna. She has suffered enough. I will not have her mourning a dead man before I am even gone." With that, the Underworld king stepped out of the medical wing, locking his emotions away behind an unbreakable, stoic mask, ready to spend his remaining days being her silent, doomed guardian. The days after his grim diagnosis were marked by a sudden, freezing distance. Dae-Riven retreated behind the high, impenetrable walls of his stoic armor. He began to intentionally avoid Saryna, offering only short, clipped responses if they happened to cross paths in the sprawling penthouse. He stopped joining her for meals, stopped asking about her day, and started suggesting that it was time they found her a secure home of her own. He was trying to push her away, to sever the fragile bonds between them before his inevitable death could shatter her completely. But Saryna was not so easily deterred. She had felt the shaking of his hands on the terrace when he checked her for injuries. She had seen the flicker of raw, unadulterated panic in his eyes when her life was on the line. She knew that beneath the terrifying reputation and the bold tattoo climbing up his neck was a man carrying a heavy, silent burden. She could sense his deep, isolating pain, and she flatly refused to leave him alone in the dark. Instead of packing her bags, Saryna decided to fight back with the only weapons she had left: warmth and care. On a particularly cold, rainy evening, she bypassed the penthouse's professional staff and stepped into the state-of-the-art kitchen herself. She ignored the expensive, imported delicacies filling the massive refrigerators and set out to make a simple, comforting meal from her own childhood, a fragrant, hearty stew that filled the cold, minimalist space with the rich, inviting aroma of home. Dae-Riven returned to the penthouse late that night, moving with the heavy, exhausted gait of a man carrying the weight of the world. He stopped dead in his tracks as the warm, savory scent hit him, instantly cutting through the sterile silence of his glass cage. He followed the aroma into the kitchen, finding Saryna standing by the stove, humming softly to herself. "I told you my staff would handle the meals," he said, his deep voice laced with a forced, icy edge as he tried to re-establish the distance. "You don't need to do this." Saryna didn't flinch. She simply turned off the burner, ladled a generous portion of the steaming stew into a bowl, and set it on the marble counter in front of him. "I wanted to do this," she replied softly, her brown eyes locking onto his with fierce, unwavering determination. "You are trying to push me away, Riven. I see it. But I'm not going anywhere. You saved me when the whole world turned its back on me. Now, sit down and eat." Dae-Riven stared at the bowl of food, and then at the courageous woman standing before him. For a long, agonizing moment, the silence stretched thin between them. Slowly, the icy exterior he had fought so hard to maintain began to crack. A heavy sigh escaped his lips. He pulled out a stool and sat down, picking up a spoon. As he took his first bite, a genuine, tired smile touched his lips for the very first time. The monster of the underworld was finally letting his guard down, allowing himself to be cared for by the woman he was dying to protect. The heavy rain that had been battering the penthouse windows finally cleared, leaving behind a night that was crisp, dark, and alive with the distant glow of city lights. The emotional shift in the kitchen had broken something open between them, and instead of retreating back to his stoic silence, Dae-Riven did something completely unexpected. He led Saryna down to the underground garage, bypassing the fleet of armored sedans, and stopped in front of a sleek, matte black motorcycle. He handed her a helmet, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Hold on tight," was all he said. Moments later, they were cutting through the quiet city streets, the powerful roar of the engine echoing against the concrete canyons. Saryna wrapped her arms tightly around Dae-Riven's waist, pressing her body against his back. The raw speed and the biting wind whipping past them should have terrified her, but with her hands locked against his strong chest, she felt an exhilarating sense of absolute freedom. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about her family's bankruptcy or Elliot's cruel betrayal. She was simply alive in the present moment. They began to climb, leaving the grid of the city behind as the motorcycle carved up a winding, secluded mountain road. Finally, Dae-Riven pulled over at a jagged cliffside clearing that looked out over the entire glowing metropolis. The city lights stretched out below them like a sea of fallen stars. They sat on a flat rock at the edge of the world, the motorcycle ticking as the engine cooled in the night air. The heavy silence was no longer awkward, it was a comfortable, shared space. "This is the only place I can hear myself think," Dae-Riven said softly, his deep voice carrying a trace of vulnerability she had never heard before. He looked out at the city he controlled, and for the first time, he began to talk about his past. He spoke of a brutal childhood on the streets, of the violence he had to master just to survive, and the heavy, soul-crushing weight of ruling the city's dark underbelly. He had built an empire, but it had cost him his youth and his peace of mind. Saryna listened quietly, resting her head on her knees. When he finished, she shared her own story. She spoke of the suffocating pressure of high society, of a life where love was conditional on bank accounts, and the absolute, crushing emptiness of realizing that the man she was going to marry never actually cared about her. They were from two vastly different worlds, one forged in cold, calculating wealth and the other in the fires of the criminal underworld. Yet, sitting there on the edge of the world, stripping away their titles and reputations, they realized they were remarkably the same. They were both survivors of a cruel world, wearing scars no one else could see. Looking at him in the moonlight, seeing the fierce protector who was slowly fading away inside, Saryna realized how much she needed his strength. And looking at her, Dae-Riven realized how desperately he needed her warmth to make his remaining days worth living. The days rolled forward, blending the harsh reality of their circumstances with moments of profound, quiet beauty. Saryna had stopped asking about his business, and Dae-Riven had stopped trying to suggest a life for her outside of his reach. They had formed a silent agreement to live entirely in the present, finding peace in a list of simple things Saryna had always wanted to do but had never been allowed to experience in her rigid, high-society life. At the very top of that list was something surprisingly ordinary: to watch a sunrise on a completely empty beach, without the noise of cameras, expectations, or demands. Long before the rest of the city began to wake, Dae-Riven drove her far beyond the edge of the metropolis to a secluded stretch of coastline. The air was biting and cold, smelling heavily of salt and wet sand. The ocean was a vast, restless mirror of deep indigo, mirroring the fading stars above. Saryna stepped out of the vehicle, slipping her shoes off to let her bare feet sink into the cold, powdery sand. She laughed softly, a sound that seemed to echo beautifully against the crash of the waves. Dae-Riven followed a few steps behind her, shedding his usual stoic guard. He had discarded his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his white shirt to expose the intricate, dark ink wrapping around his forearms. They walked in comfortable silence along the water's edge, leaving a single set of parallel footprints behind them. Saryna watched him out of the corner of her eye. Even in this serene setting, with the wind tossing his hair, he radiated raw authority and power. Yet, as the sky began to bleed into brilliant shades of liquid gold, soft pink, and burning orange, she saw the exhaustion weighing down his features. As the sun finally crested above the horizon, painting the world in a warm, breathtaking glow, Saryna stopped. She turned to face him, the golden light reflecting in her deep brown eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with sudden emotion. "No one has ever cared about what I actually wanted before. Not like this." Dae-Riven looked down at her, his jaw clenching as a fierce, overwhelming wave of emotion threatened to shatter his control. Looking at her standing there, the wind whipping her clothes and the golden sunrise framing her face, he realized that he didn't care about the empire he had built or the time he was losing. All that mattered was the woman before him. He reached out, his large, calloused hand cupping her cheek with a gentleness that defied his terrifying reputation. Saryna leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut as a soft sigh escaped her lips. Slowly, deliberately, Dae-Riven leaned down. When his lips finally met hers, the world around them seemed to fall away. It was an intense, passionate kiss, born of absolute desperation, fierce protection, and a profound, wordless love. In that golden morning light, on the edge of a vast and uncaring world, the king of the underworld silently vowed to love her with every single breath he had left. The golden warmth of the beach sunrise felt like a lifetime away when the cold reality of the poison finally struck. They were back in the penthouse office when the glass in Dae-Riven's hands suddenly slipped, shattering on the floor. Saryna turned just in time to see the towering, immovable king of the underworld buckle, his knees hitting the plush rug before he collapsed entirely. The chaos that followed was a blur of flashing red lights, sterile white corridors, and the frantic orders of Dr. Thorne. Sitting in a private, heavily guarded hospital wing, Saryna felt the familiar, suffocating grip of fear tightening around her chest. But when Dr. Thorne finally pulled her aside, the fear crystallized into a heavy, devastating grief. He laid it all bare: the failed assassination attempt, the slow-acting neurotoxin, and the irreversible organ failure that was now claiming his life. Dae-Riven had less than 48 hours to live. Saryna walked into his sterile room, her heart breaking at the sight of the fierce, powerful man now hooked up to beeping monitors. His eyes fluttered open as she approached, the brilliant fire in them dimmed but not extinguished. "I'm sorry," he rasped, his voice a ghost of the commanding growl that had once frozen a room of 200 people. "I didn't want you to carry this dark ending." Saryna didn't run. She didn't cry out in anger at his secret. Instead, she stepped forward and took his large, pale hand in both of her small, warm ones. A fierce, unwavering determination burned in her eyes. "You didn't let me fall when the whole world pushed me down, Riven. I am not leaving you now. And I am definitely not letting you go into the dark alone." Turning to a tearful Dr. Thorne and the guards at the door, she demanded they find a chaplain or a notary. She wasn't asking, she was issuing a command that would rival any of Dae-Riven's. Right there in that sterile hospital room, with the continuous beep of the heart monitor serving as their background music, they exchanged their vows. There were no high society guests, no cameras, and no grand displays, just two broken souls promising to belong to each other for whatever time was left. As the words were finalized, a genuine, profound sense of peace washed over Dae-Riven's face. The heavy burden of ruling the city, the pain of the poison, and the fear of leaving her unprotected seemed to melt away. He squeezed her hand gently, a soft, tired smile touching his lips for the very last time. A few hours later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the heart monitor let out a long, continuous tone. Kang Dae-Riven, the feared Underworld king, passed away in the arms of the only woman who had ever truly loved him, completely at peace. The digital world eventually moved on from the viral spectacle of the Grand Pearl Hotel and the sudden, shocking passing of Kang Dae-Riven. The media had spun a dozen different conspiracy theories about the sudden fall of the Underworld king, but none of them came close to the quiet, heartbreaking truth. Saryna remained isolated at the top of the glass monolith, moving through the massive, minimalist penthouse like a ghost. The silence of the apartment was no longer a comforting sanctuary, it was a heavy, suffocating reminder of the man who was no longer there. 8 weeks had passed since the hospital room where they had exchanged their vows. 8 weeks of waking up to a world that felt colder, darker, and infinitely emptier. But that morning, the heavy silence was shattered by a soft gasp in the master bathroom. Saryna sat on the cold marble floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she stared down at the small plastic stick in her hand. Two distinct, dark lines stared back at her. Positive. A fresh wave of overwhelming emotion crashed over her. Tears that she thought had finally run dry began to spill over her lashes, hot and fast, blurring her vision. She pressed her hand flat against her still flat stomach, her shoulders shaking with quiet, breathless sobs. He was gone. The fierce protector who had stepped out of the shadows to save her was gone, and he would never know that he was going to be a father. He would never get to hold his child. But as the initial shock began to subside, a new, powerful feeling began to take root in the depths of her soul. It was a fierce, burning resolve. This baby was not just a reminder of her grief, it was a living testament to their love. It was a beautiful piece of the man who had loved her completely in his final days, a part of him that got to stay behind. Saryna stood up, wiping the tears from her eyes, and walked out onto the sprawling outdoor balcony where they had stood on his last healthy night. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the distant, rhythmic hum of the massive city below. She stepped right up to the glass railing, looking out over the endless grid of glowing lights and towering skyscrapers. This was the empire he had built. This was the city he had mastered, the ground that shook whenever he spoke. Elliot Voss was long gone, ruined and forgotten, but Kang Dae-Riven's presence still echoed in the very concrete of the streets. Saryna placed both of her hands over her stomach, staring out at the horizon as the very first rays of dawn began to bleed into the sky, painting the world in shades of liquid gold. "Hi, baby," she whispered into the wind, her voice suddenly thick with strength and absolute certainty. Your father was the king of this city. He was the bravest, most protective man I ever knew. And I am going to make sure you know exactly who he was. Standing there at the edge of the world, Saryna was no longer the broken, bankrupt socialite who had collapsed beside a ruined gown. She was the keeper of his legacy, ready to raise the heir to the king's empire. Thank you for watching till the end. Stay safe and on your notification button for other stories to come.